Okay, so I'm going to be talking to you about the evolution of the human foot and the biomechanics of barefoot running. So I'm sure that many of you watched the 2012 Olympics, and for those of you who did and who watched the track and field events, the three people on the screen should look pretty familiar to you. From left to right, they are Ryan Hall, Desiree Davila, and Abdi. And all these three were Olympic runners, Olympic distance runners, and all three of them have something in common. They were all unable to complete their Olympic races due to injury: hamstring, hip flexor, and knee joint. So I personally find this really strange, that these runners who trained for years and who have so much experience, who are theoretically the best at their sport, are not able to finish a race that they've run so many times before simply due to an injury. It's not because they don't have the endurance or because they don't have the speed, but because they're hurt. You know, it's strange because human feet were evolved to run. Compared to other organisms, we're not really the best at anything because we're not the strongest, we are not the fastest, we're not the most nimble. But when it comes to endurance running, we humans are better than anything else on the planet because unlike other creatures, we can sweat, so we have a natural advantage. In the words of Christopher McDougall, who wrote Born to Run, we can run really, really far on a hot, hot day. In fact, we get stronger as distances get longer. So, Okay, so as you can see, natural selection drove early humans to develop bodies specifically suited for endurance running because we were scavengers or hunters. The four key features that humans have developed that allow us to be such strong distance runners is that we are stable, we have modified limbs that reduce the amount of stress that we place on our body when we run, we have great efficiency, and we're also excellent thermoregulators because, like I mentioned, humans have the amazing capability to sweat so that we can run in hot weather without dying of heat like most other animals. So knowing that humans were literally born to run, it's strange that modern runners are getting injured so frequently. But what's even stranger is that our ancestors, who ran farther than we did in even more extreme temperatures, did not get injured like we did. Terms like shin splints and plantar fasciitis that are prevalent in the running community today would have been foreign to our ancestors, not just because they didn't know what they meant, because they didn't occur in the past. These injuries we face are unique to our time, and recent research has provided many hypotheses for why this is true. So for example, some of the most popular ones are that some people believe that today's runners run longer distances at faster speeds. For example, in the 1982 marathon, 26 miles in just about 2 hours. But if we think that we ran long distances, like if marathons are long, then our ancestors ran like mega marathons because they ran at some points 150 miles at one time. And considering that the reason that they did this was to hunt down animals that they had to eat with their bare bodies, it's pretty safe to assume that they were running pretty fast as well. Another hypothesis that people have is that today we run on harder substrates. But older surfaces were just as hard. In fact, while today we have the luxury of often running distances on fields and trails, most of the surfaces that people ran on back then were just hard, dry rock. And finally, still others think that the larger population of middle-aged runners today contributes to the higher injury rates because as we grow older, our bodies grow weaker, right? Which may be true, but the fact remains that injury rates are still very, very high in young athletes. So if none of these hypotheses are correct, and humans are evolved to run, then why are we getting injured so frequently? Why each year do 30 to 70% of runners get injured with like those numbers haven't been decreasing in the last 30 years? Perhaps the answer lies in a fairly recent development that has had a huge impact on the way we run: running shoes. So we in modern times have gone off the path. We've started using these fancy cushioned things that are supposed to make us better runners. And they come in all shapes and sizes and brands and styles. And millions of these shoes are purchased every single day, since these things have become almost a necessity in order to run. But regardless of how diverse these shoes are, one thing has remained the same, that human runners are still getting hurt. We've shifted from this simplistic view of running to a very consumerized, commercialized take. Anyone can run, right? And it's easy for corporate America to take advantage of that fact. The first step to becoming a runner in our present society is to buy a pair of shoes or a pair of shorts because we need those things to run. The focus has shifted to trying to convince people that extra accessories are necessary to being able to run, even though our ancestors, the most successful runners, relied solely on their bare feet. And these accessories called shoes, the main and probably most recent difference between modern running and ancient running could be the reason for the majority of our injuries. So naturally, this question, or this assertion, begs the question of what effect modern running shoes actually have on our body and on the way we run. So there are three main differences that I want to talk about today that running shoes provide compared to the way our barefoot ancestors ran. So first, they limit proprioception and sensation. I'm just going to go through all of these here. So when we run in shoes, it's really easy for our body to ignore injuries, whereas if you run barefoot, if you break your toe, you'll know in an instant because you'll feel it. Whereas shoes often provide enough support to disguise the feedback mechanisms that tell us that we're hurt. So you could potentially keep running on a broken foot for days without realizing you're injured, or maybe not a broken foot, but like a sprained foot. So naturally, this leads to more traumatic and more repetitive injuries. So shoes also make our feet very, very lazy. Our feet are naturally designed to be great shock absorbers and also to provide levers for us to push off of when we run. However, by wearing cushioned shoes, we're essentially telling our bodies that they don't need to do the work, that the shoes will do it for them. And eventually we lose these important abilities and our feet get weaker. Additionally, shoes change the way our feet develop. By squishing our toes together, as you can see in the picture on the bottom right, and molding the shape of our feet, shoes lead to more foot abnormalities and more instances of flat feet. So if you take a look at the picture on the bottom right, you can see that in feet that have been in shoes their entire life, the toes are much more squished together and the shape of the foot is much more narrow, whereas on the far right, a foot that has been barefoot for the majority of its life is much more spread out and the toes are sort of more individual from each other. So the third and perhaps most significant impact that modern shoes have had on our bodies is that they change the way that we run. The large heels on modern running shoes encourage us to heel strike when we run rather than forefoot strike. So as you can see in the picture, the child on the left who grew up running barefoot has a distinct forefoot strike compared to the heel strike on the right. So the difference is that in heel striking, the collision of your heel with the ground generates a huge impact transient, which is sort of an instantaneous large force. And this force sends a shock wave up your body through the skeletal system and puts lots of pressure on your bones, which is naturally not a good thing. So if you watch, you can see that his heel hits a treadmill before his toes. So there you go. Forefoot striking, on the other hand, has a much smaller impact transient because landing on your forefoot creates a much softer collision with the ground, as you can see there. So empirical data also shows that 97 to 100% of people who grew up running barefoot have a forefoot strike, which is better for you, whereas only 3 to 5% of people who grow up wearing shoes have the same forefoot strike. So in addition to preserving the natural advantages that humans have for endurance running, barefoot runners have also been quite successful in the past. As you can see on the left is a picture of Abebe Bikila, who set the world record in the Olympic marathon in 1960. And on the right, Zola Budd, who set the world record in the women's 5K in 1984, although she's better known for tripping Mary Decker Sloan in her race. So when we look back at the question of whether or not running shoes are actually, when we look back at the question of whether or not running shoes are actually good for our feet and whether they're actually working, we can see that in a huge sense, they aren't. Expensive shoes that are often claimed to be very effective still have high injury rates that haven't decreased in the past 30 years where shoes have really taken off. And better cushioning only increases the impact transient that you saw, puts even more pressure on the human foot. From a consumer standpoint, however, the running shoe market is very successful, and I'm sure that most people can say that they love their running shoes and the way they look. However, it's important to decide whether we should value consumer satisfaction over the health of our feet and our body, or vice versa. So whichever way you lean, the fact remains that the more shoe you have on your foot, the more the natural movement of your foot is impeded. So minimalism is really the key. And it's important for us to restore our natural ways of running and return to the more basic sense of the word, as our ancestors did. Because as skeletal biology shows us, they were the most successful and the least injured. And I think we can all agree that a less injured runner or walker is a more fit runner or walker. Plus, research shows that not only the physical benefits, but also the social and mental benefits of returning to moving around on our true feet could be great. In the words again of Chris McDougall, who wrote Born to Run, if you read folklore and mythology, running is always associated with freedom and vitality and youthfulness and eternal vigor. It's only in our lifetime that running has become associated with fear and pain, and perhaps that can be changed. So I'm not saying that anybody should suddenly start trying to walk around completely barefoot or run around completely barefoot, because a sudden transition to barefoot running from wearing shoes can place too much pressure on muscles that have been previously unused, but rather that those of you who want to should slowly transition into more natural and minimal footwear, such as 5 fingers, which I personally really like, or any other minimal footwear. Because not only does skeletal evidence show that it could be better for your feet, but perhaps it could also be better for your soles.